Silence has a sound. It's the sound of a room full of powerful people realizing they need someone they already decided didn't matter. The private dining room at Aurelius in the financial district of Chicago wasn't just a restaurant. It was a negotiation in architectural form. Every detail had been designed to communicate one thing: you are among the elite. The walls were clad in burnished walnut panels. The lighting came from fixtures that cost more than most people's cars. The tablecloths were changed between every course, not laundered, changed, replaced with fresh pressed linen, the color of heavy cream. For the staff who worked Aurelius, the room was a theater, and their role was simple: be invisible. Zoe Park understood invisible. At 29, she had perfected it. She stood near the service credenza on the east wall, a silver tray balanced along her forearm, watching the table in the center of the room with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned the hard way that stillness kept you employed. Tonight's private booking was a 4-top. She'd read the reservation notes before service: corporate dinner, extended hours, gratuity pre-authorized at 22%. What the notes hadn't mentioned was that it would turn into the most consequential 2 hours of her life. On one side of the table sat Crane and Aldridge. Conrad Crane was the founder and CEO of a Chicago-based supply chain software company called Paravex, a man whose entire personality seemed to have been assembled from a checklist titled "How to Seem Important." He wore a suit that cost more than Zoe's monthly rent and a watch that cost more than her car. He was 53, silver-haired, and had the particular kind of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from having never been seriously contradicted. Beside him sat his vice president of business development, a man named Fletcher Aldridge, who was younger, sharper dressed, and meaner in the particular way that ambitious men who feel underestimated tend to be mean, with precision, with intention, like a scalpel rather than a hammer. Across from them sat Mrs. Hyun Soo-jin. Zoe had recognized the name the moment she saw it on the reservation. Anyone who followed Korean business news, which, admittedly, was not most servers in Chicago, would have recognized it. Mrs. Hyun was the founder of Soo-jin Capital, a Seoul-based private equity firm that had made a habit of acquiring struggling American tech companies, restructuring them and selling them at a profit that made investment bankers in New York genuinely uncomfortable. She was 61 years old, wore a charcoal silk blouse with no jewelry except a single jade ring on her right hand, and carried herself with the kind of composed authority that didn't need a room to announce itself. She spoke almost no English. This, Zoe understood immediately, was the catastrophic miscalculation at the center of the evening. Mrs. Hyun had arrived with her assistant, a young woman named Claire, who had served as her English interpreter for the past 3 years. Claire had made it as far as the lobby of the hotel across the street before collapsing with what turned out to be a severe allergic reaction to something she'd eaten on the flight. She was currently in an emergency room on Michigan Avenue. Mrs. Hyun, who operated on a philosophy of rigid punctuality and refused to let anyone else's misfortune alter her schedule, had come to dinner anyway. She had her phone, she had her composure. She had decided, with the particular iron certainty of a woman who had built a 9-figure business from a rented office in Mapo district, that she would manage. Conrad Crane had not been informed of any of this until Mrs. Hyun sat down, and his opening pleasantry, a breezy "so wonderful to finally meet you in person," was met with a polite, unreadable nod and the quiet placement of a translation app on the tablecloth between them. Zoe watched Conrad's face process this information in real time. It moved through several stages: confusion, alarm, forced optimism, and then a species of thin-lipped resolve that she recognized as a man deciding that a problem could be managed. by simply refusing to acknowledge its full severity. Fletcher had no such optimism. He pulled out his own phone immediately and began typing. Zoe moved forward to pour the sparkling water. She had studied Korean for 6 years. Not casually, not as a hobby, she had studied it the way people study things when the study itself becomes a lifeline. Her mother, Zoe Park, had emigrated from Busan in 1989. She had worked her entire adult life in a dry cleaning business in Evanston, threading alterations by hand until her fingers stiffened, speaking English with a competence she never quite trusted, and Korean with the fluency of someone who dreamed in it. Zoe had grown up between those two languages, code switching at the dinner table, reading her mother's Korean novels when she ran out of English ones. She had gone on to study East Asian linguistics at Northwestern, where she'd specialized in the formal register distinctions in Korean business speech, a subject so specific it had confused her academic advisor but fascinated her completely. She had been 8 months from finishing her master's thesis when her mother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. The disease moved quickly. The dry cleaning business couldn't survive without her mother running it, and it turned out the business had been surviving on remarkably thin margins for years. A fact her mother had protected Zoe from with a careful, loving dishonesty. There were debts. There were gaps in the insurance. There were costs that materialized with a specificity and a cruelty that Zoe hadn't been prepared for. She had deferred her thesis, taken a leave of absence that had quietly become permanent, and found herself 18 months later standing in the dining rooms of expensive restaurants, invisible, fluent in 3 languages that no one at these tables knew she spoke. She needed this job, not in the abstract, motivational poster sense. She needed it the way you need oxygen, specifically, urgently, with consequences attached to failure. The Aurelius had strict codes of conduct for its service staff. Don't engage with guests beyond what is required. Don't volunteer opinions. Don't interject into conversations. The head of service, a tall, exacting Frenchman named Sébastien, who had worked in Michelin-starred restaurants on 2 continents, had communicated these expectations on Zoe's first day with the particular gravity of someone reading from scripture. You are here to serve the meal. The meal is not about you. It is never about you. Zoe stood by the credenza and listened to Conrad Crane attempt to conduct a business dinner through a translation app. It was, objectively, a disaster. The app Conrad was using, she could see it from where she stood, was a general-purpose consumer tool, adequate for asking directions or ordering coffee. It was not built for business Korean, and it was emphatically not built for the formal registers that a woman of Mrs. Hyen's generation and standing would expect. Korean has an intricate system of speech levels, honorifics layered into verb endings, and vocabulary choices that communicate deference, respect, and relational position as clearly as anything that's actually said. When Conrad held his phone across the table and said, at an unnecessary volume, "We are very excited about the partnership opportunity," the app translated this with the approximate formality of a text message between college students. Mrs. Hyen's expression did not change. It never really changed. But Zoe, who had spent years learning to read the microsignals in Korean formal behavior, watched the barely perceptible stillness that moved across the older woman's face, the kind of stillness that precedes withdrawal. Fletcher, meanwhile, had given up on the app and was attempting to communicate through a combination of enthusiastic hand gestures and a printed slide deck he had produced from his bag. He slid it across the table with the blunt confidence of a man who believed that visual aids could overcome any barrier. Mrs. Hyen looked at the slide deck. She looked at Fletcher. She did not touch it. She's being written off, Zoe thought. standing very still by the credenza, and she knows it, and they have no idea that she knows it. Mrs. Hyen spoke. She spoke quietly, to herself, or perhaps to no one in Korean, the elevated, measured Korean of boardrooms and formal addresses. She said, "These men did not prepare. They do not know who they are meeting. I have crossed an ocean to sit across from people who treat communication as someone else's problem." Zoe's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray. She set it down on the credenza without sound. She picked up the water pitcher. She walked to the table to refill glasses, moving into the close radius of the conversation the way she'd been trained to. Smoothly, without announcement, functionally invisible. As she poured, Fletcher was saying something to Conrad in a low, conspiratorial voice. He had stopped trying to communicate with Mrs. Hyen directly and had apparently decided to use the dinner to strategize with Conrad as though she weren't there. "She's not reacting to anything," Fletcher muttered, watching the older woman from the corner of his eye. "We're not getting read. I don't know if she's interested or if she flew here to walk away." "She's here, isn't she?" Conrad said, "She's here because her assistant is in the hospital and she doesn't want to reschedule. That's not the same as interest." Fletcher set down his fork. She built her whole reputation on catching people who think they're smarter than her. Every acquisition she's made, she's gone in knowing more about the target than the target knew about itself. We need to get the term sheet in front of her tonight. If we let this dinner end without a signature, she flies back to Seoul and we lose the window. Then let's get the term sheet out. Now, we haven't even finished the first course. Fletcher. Conrad's voice dropped to a register that was clearly meant to convey authority. "We are not leaving this table without at least a letter of intent. Get the documents." Zoe moved away from the table. She set the pitcher back on the credenza. She stood very still and breathed through the thing she was feeling, which was several things at once. The familiar low-grade anxiety of doing her job correctly, the older and heavier weight of her mother's upcoming physical therapy appointments, and the bill that would follow, and something new and sharp. A recognition that the woman sitting across that table was about to be handled in a way she would not have consented to if she understood what was happening. Fletcher retrieved a tablet from his bag. He opened a document and slid the device across the table. Not the deliberate, two-handed, slightly formal presentation that Mrs. Hyen's cultural context would have expected, but the flat, casual, American boardroom slide of someone passing a menu at a diner. Mrs. Hyen looked at the tablet. She looked at the two men. She picked it up. She began to read. She read slowly, with the focused attention of someone who reads legal documents for pleasure, or at least for professional survival. Her English was not conversational, but Zoe had noticed, from working in rooms like this one, that the gap between speaking English and reading English was often much wider than people assumed in either direction. Mrs. Yun was reading something, and something in what she was reading was making her expression do a thing it hadn't done all evening. It was going very, very still. Zoe's chest tightened. She crossed to the credenza on the pretext of restacking napkins and angled herself so she could see the tablet screen in the ambient light. She was close enough. She had good eyes. She read the document heading and 2 paragraphs, and then she understood exactly what expression Mrs. Hyen was wearing, because she felt the same one forming on her own face. The document being presented as a letter of intent for strategic partnership was not that. Not really. Buried on the second page, under a heading that read Operational Integration Provisions, was a clause that would, upon signing, restructure Paravex as a subsidiary acquisition rather than a partnership. It would give Sujin Capital what appeared on the surface to be a 30% equity stake. What it actually gave them according to the liability language 6 paragraphs down, was 30% of the equity and 100% of the existing debt obligations. Obligations, which Zoe had reason to believe, from a fragment of conversation she'd caught earlier, were considerably more than what the balance sheet being presented would suggest. She had caught the fragment 20 minutes ago. Fletcher, thinking himself unobserved, had been on his phone near the service entrance during the course transition. She had heard him say, very quietly, "Just make sure the Deloitte summary isn't in the packet." She's not going to read English footnotes anyway. She had filed it away the way she filed most things, in the part of herself that had been paying attention long after she had any practical use for the information. She had been wrong about that. Mrs. Hyen set the tablet back on the table with a precise, deliberate motion. She looked at the two men across from her. She said something in Korean quietly, with the particular composure of someone who has been insulted but has decided that visible anger would be a concession. What she said was, "I would like to know if they believe I cannot read, or if they believe I will not." And in that moment, Zoe Park stopped being invisible. She didn't decide to stop. It wasn't a conscious act of bravery in the cinematic sense, no swelling music, no moment of crystalline resolve. It was simpler than that. It was the same decision her mother had made, over and over, in a language she didn't fully trust, in a country that hadn't made space for her. The decision that some things were worth the cost of speaking up. She set down the napkins. She walked to the table. She stopped at a respectful distance from Mrs. Hyen, not directly between her and the men, but beside her, slightly inclined, in the posture of someone offering service rather than confrontation. She spoke in Korean. Formal Korean, careful and clean, the register she had studied until it became instinct. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Hyen. I am a member of the service staff. I speak Korean, and I would be glad to offer translation this evening if that would be useful to you." The effect on the room was immediate and total. Mrs. Hyen turned her head and looked at Zoe. It was not a casual look. It was the full attention, assessing look of someone who has learned to evaluate people quickly and accurately, because the cost of misreading them is high. She studied Zoe's face, her posture, the quality of the Korean she had just spoken. "Where did you learn?" Mrs. Hyen asked. She asked it simply, without warmth or coldness, the way you'd ask a craftsperson about their training. "My mother is from Busan," Zoe said. "I studied East Asian linguistics at Northwestern. I specialized in formal register systems in Korean business speech." Something shifted in Mrs. Hyen's expression. Not dramatically. She was not a woman who did things dramatically. But a small specific quality of guardedness softened just fractionally, the way a door that was locked doesn't open, but allows you to feel that it could. "You may translate," Mrs. Hyen said. Conrad was staring at Zoe as though she had appeared from nowhere, which, from his perspective, she essentially had. "I'm sorry, what just happened?" "Mrs. Hyen has agreed to allow me to provide translation for the remainder of the dinner," Zoe said, turning to him with the even, professional composure she had spent months perfecting. She would like to continue the conversation. "You speak Korean?" Fletcher said. He said it the way people sometimes say surprising things, not as a question, but as an objection wearing a question's clothes. "Fluently," Zoe said. She held his gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than was strictly comfortable. "Shall we continue?" Conrad let out a breath that had clearly been held for a significant time. "Yes. Yes, please. Tell her we're very pleased she's here, and we'd like to walk her through the terms of the letter of intent." Zoe turned to Mrs. Hyen. She translated Conrad's greeting with the appropriate formality, the correct honorifics, the warmth that the occasion called for. She watched Mrs. Hyen's posture shift, not dramatically, but measurably. The temperature in the room, which had been hovering somewhere between frost and formality, rose by a few degrees, and then Zoe looked at the tablet. She had hoped, in the 30 seconds between her decision to speak and this moment, that she had misread the document. She had hoped that the clause she'd seen was standard language, protective rather than predatory, the kind of dense legalese that means less than it sounds. She hadn't misread it. She read it again, carefully, while Conrad talked about synergies, and Fletcher watched her with an expression she recognized as monitoring. She read the liability provision. She read the footnote that the provision referenced, which was printed in a font small enough that you'd have to be actively looking for it. She read the number that appeared in that footnote, the total outstanding debt obligation that the signatory would assume, and she felt, briefly, the floor tilt under her feet. The number was $47 million. The equity stake being offered was priced at $30 million. Mrs. Hyan would be paying $30 million to assume $47 million in debt and receive a majority stake in a company that could not service its existing obligations. "Tell her," Fletcher said, watching Zoe with the focused attention of someone who has noticed that she is reading more carefully than he expected, that the operational integration provisions are standard international partnership language. It's the same framework we've used with all our European partners. Zoe looked at him. She looked at him for a moment. "Of course," she said. She turned to Mrs. Hyan. She did not say that. What she said, in the formal Korean of a woman who has learned to be precise in the moments that count, was this: "The document they have given you contains a liability provision on the second page. Under the operational integration heading, there is a clause that would transfer Paravex's existing debt obligations to your firm upon signing. The total obligation is listed in the footnote as $47 million. The equity stake being offered is priced at $30 million. They are asking you to pay $30 million to absorb $47 million in debt." Mrs. Hyan did not gasp. She did not move. She sat with the precise, unhurried stillness of someone receiving information she had, perhaps, half expected. "And the man on the left," Mrs. Hyan said, her voice barely above a murmur, "just instructed you to tell me that this clause is standard." "Yes," Zoe said. A silence opened up between them that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. To Zoe, it felt longer. "Why are you telling me this?" Mrs. Hyan asked. Her voice had no accusation in it. It was a genuine question. "You work here. If this dinner ends badly, your employer suffers. These men will complain about you. It is a significant risk. My mother built a business in this city for 30 years, Zoe said. She trusted people who showed her documents she didn't fully understand, and she signed things that cost her more than she could afford. I've spent the last 2 years watching what that kind of trust costs." She paused. "I'm not going to stand here and pour water while someone does that to someone else." Mrs. Hyan looked at her for a long moment. "Tell them," she said finally, "that I have a question about the footnote on page 2. Zoe turned to Conrad and Fletcher. "Mrs. Hyan has reviewed the letter of intent. She has a question regarding the liability footnote on page 2. The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence, entirely. Conrad's face went through a rapid, involuntary sequence of expressions. Fletcher's went very still, very fast. The stillness of a man who has realized, simultaneously, that something has gone wrong, and that he cannot immediately identify how badly. "What footnote?" Conrad said. "Page 2, under operational integration provisions," Zoe said. "The outstanding debt obligation. She'd like to understand the current figure." Fletcher's hand moved to the tablet. He picked it up. For a moment Zoe thought he was going to close the document. Instead, he looked at Conrad with an expression that, for just a moment, unguarded and unmanaged, was pure alarm. Conrad turned to Zoe. His voice had dropped. Where did you read the loan documents? That figure isn't in this letter. It's in the footnote, Zoe said. Conrad looked at Fletcher. Fletcher looked at the table. Mrs. Yun spoke again in Korean, calmly. Tell them that I've had my legal team review Paravex's public filings for the past 6 months. I knew before I sat down tonight that the company carries significant undisclosed obligations. I wanted to see what they would show me. This tells me what I needed to know. Zoe translated this without alteration. The effect was, from a certain perspective, extraordinary. Conrad Crane, a man who had spent 30 years in rooms like this one, projecting the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person present. Slowly, with visible effort, deflated. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, in his expensive suit, in the candlelight of one of the most exclusive dining rooms in Chicago, and looked like what he actually was. A man who had flown too close to the sun on wings he hadn't properly inspected. Fletcher recovered more quickly. He always did. He turned to Zoe with the sharp-edged composure of someone who has lost the battle but is calculating the terms of a retreat. This conversation is confidential, he said. Whatever she does or doesn't know, this stays in this room. You're a server. You've inserted yourself into a closed corporate negotiation. There are legal implications to what you've just. Fletcher? Mrs. Hyun said his name, his English name, which she was not supposed to know how to pronounce. She said it with perfect clarity and without accent, and she looked at him as she said it, and Fletcher Aldridge went quiet. She spoke in Korean, still looking at him, and Zoe translated. Tell him that my personal attorney is Park Sung-woo, who was trained at Columbia Law School and has handled international arbitration cases in 11 countries. If he would like to discuss the legal implications of this evening, I am happy to provide a number. She paused. And tell him that I speak enough English to have understood approximately half of what he and his colleague said to each other during dinner. I have found that people reveal more when they believe they are not understood. The table was very quiet. Zoe translated this. She translated it clearly, precisely, without softening anything. Fletcher put his phone in his pocket. Conrad put his face in his hands. Mrs. Hyun reached out and placed the tablet, face down, at the center of the table. It was a small gesture, but it had the weight of a gavel. She turned to Zoe. You have done me a genuine service tonight, she said, in the measured, formal Korean that Zoe had come to recognize as her natural register. Not the coldness she'd misread it as earlier, but a kind of precision, a respect for the importance of words. I would like to ask you something, and I want you to understand that the question is serious. Of course, Zoe said. What is your educational background? Zoe told her. Northwestern, linguistics. The master's program she'd left, the thesis she hadn't finished. She told it simply, without apology or embellishment. Mrs. Hyun listened. Why did you leave? She asked. My mother got sick, Zoe said, and someone had to take care of things. Mrs. Hyun was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I started my company with $40,000 and a rented desk in a building in Mapo that the landlord should have been embarrassed to rent. Every person who told me I was too specific, too small, too careful about things that didn't matter. I kept a list, not out of bitterness, out of attention. The things people dismiss are often the things that matter most. She looked at Zoe steadily. You have a rare skill. I don't mean the language. Many people speak Korean. I mean the capacity to read a room, to hold multiple considerations simultaneously under pressure, to choose honesty at cost to yourself. That is not taught in a linguistics program. Zoe didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what to say. I am opening a North American advisory office, Mrs. Hyun said. Based in Chicago, I need a chief liaison. Someone who understands both the language and the culture on both sides, who can be present in negotiations, who can tell me when something is wrong before it becomes expensive. She paused. I am offering you the position. The salary is 3 times what this restaurant pays you. There is a healthcare package that I am told is genuinely comprehensive. I would also like, if you would allow it, to cover the outstanding balance of your mother's current medical obligations. Not as charity, as an advance against your first-year salary, to be structured however you prefer. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, the Chicago evening was proceeding normally, indifferent to the fact that Zoe's entire life had just reorganized itself around a different axis. She thought about her mother, about the dry cleaning shop, about the Korean novels, about the Northwestern library, where she'd spent 3 years learning to pass the difference between things that sounded similar but meant entirely different things, because precision mattered, because the distance between what was said and what was meant could be enormous, could be costly, could be the difference between a fair agreement and a trap. Yes, she said, I would be honored. Mrs. Hyan nodded once, with the slight formality of someone sealing something real. Zoe turned back to the table. Conrad was still sitting with his hands folded in front of him, looking at the tablecloth. Fletcher had his phone out, but wasn't doing anything with it. The slide deck sat between them, its cheerful infographic of a handshake now seeming, in the silence, almost absurd. Is there anything further I can translate for you? Zoe asked them, her voice professionally even. Neither man answered. She went to the service credenza and retrieved the black leather folio with the evening's bill. She set it down quietly between the 2 men and walked away from the table without looking back. Behind her, she heard the sound of Conrad Crane picking up the folio. She heard the small, sharp intake of breath that followed. The dinner for 4 at Aurelius, the Wagyu, the truffle accompaniments, the 2011 Burgundy that Fletcher had ordered without consulting anyone, came to just under $4,000. Sebastian was waiting for her near the service corridor, his expression arranged into something between fury and confusion. He had, apparently, been watching from a distance. Park, he said. My office. I'm resigning, Sebastian, Zoe said pleasantly. I'll work out the shift, but I think you'll find tonight covered. She reached back and untied her apron. She folded it over her arm, walked to the coat check to retrieve her things, and then walked out through the front entrance of Aurelius into the cold, clear air of a Chicago evening. Mrs. Hyan was waiting near the car. Her assistant, Claire, had sent a text from the hospital. Stable, allergic reaction resolved. She'd be back on her feet in the morning. Mrs. Hyan looked at Zoe as she came through the door. The faintest suggestion of a smile crossed her face, not the managed, negotiating variety, but the real kind, brief and unguarded. I should tell you, the older woman said, in Korean, that I was not planning to leave without speaking to you regardless of how the dinner had gone. Zoe looked at her. You knew? I knew you understood me, Mrs. Hyan said, simply, from the moment you were pouring the water, the way you held very still when I spoke. Most people, when they hear a language they don't understand, let their eyes go soft. Your eyes didn't. Zoe thought about this. My mother used to say that the most useful thing you can know is what the people around you actually mean, she said, us. Mrs. Hyan nodded. They walked toward the waiting car together, and the city opened up around them, lit and indifferent, and full of the particular possibility that belongs to nights when everything changes at once.